Okay, I've started the recording. So as we said, Javier has prepared something for us today. So handing over to you, Javier. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, let me see. We share my screen here. So does everyone can see it correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, regarding this system, one of the things I've been mentioning before, and I wanted to talk to you guys about the clean architecture overview. I don't know if I guess some of you guys might be aware of clean architecture in general, and I don't know if you're if you have any experience or any relationship with it in the Android world. But I wanted to explain it to you and a high level concept of the architecture in itself, and also how could it be actually applied in Android to assess if it will be interesting to create something similar in our case and move our architecture forwards for the next few months. So as I said, this is a two-part presentation. This first presentation is going to be about clean architecture overview and about like concepts and ideas regarding this type of architecture. And the next one that I'll try to do as soon as possible, it will be how we could actually plan this architecture in the context of our own system and our own code, and how we could take steps forwards to moving towards if this type of architecture taking into account our real case. And I will talk to a few of you guys, and I will try to collect information from a few of you guys to be able to actually do this. So yeah, so if we dive into like the architecture in itself, before anything, I think it's worth asking like, why do we need architectures, and why do we need actually to define a certain type of architecture? And especially we need to answer a few questions. For example, one of them is if we can actually add new functionality fast. So with the architecture that we actually currently have, if this is actually true or not. Another question that we should ask ourselves is like, is actually our code base prepared to scale? So at the moment, if I remember, like we are around like 10 developers, something like that, 100 developers. But anyway, like if actually tomorrow, or the next few months, we will actually scale to 20, 30 developers, it's actually our code base, and also the contributions and the amount of code being produced is going to scale. It's actually our code base and architecture facilitates actually creating, a scalable solution or not. Something else as well, if it's actually hard to maintain. So if our current solution is actually causing issues for all the developers to be able to actually maintain the code and be able to do this from a quality, perspective and regressions as low as possible. Finally, but the next one, it will be about technical debt. Also, how are we dealing with technical debt? This is something that we will never avoid, and with every project that we do, and everyone does, always has some sort of a technical debt, and especially with these large complex systems, it's impossible to avoid. So one of the things we will need to take into account is how we're going to deal with this technical debt. And then also how we're going to keep it healthy and sane. So as I say, not only the architecture is something that you can think and start implementing, but it's something that we need to take, measure around during time and be able to actually to keep it healthy and to keep it sane. And this is something that we need to ask ourselves: is our current system is actually keeping it healthy and sane for the next few months? And finally, and foremost, is actually if it's actually easy to onboard new people or not. So our architecture should be well documented. It should actually well explained, and also we should ask if this is actually the case with the architectures that we're actually using at the moment. And something the architecture should actually answer: if it's easy to onboard new people or not. So when new developers come, if it's easy for them to be able to get into the overall picture of how everything is actually set up or not. So, of course, I just want to dive really quickly of benefits of good architecture. So, of course, rapid development, a good architecture would allow us to be able to move forward and faster in a much higher velocity. Also, it would allow us to have good scalability. So, if we scale solutions, so we scale our internal team, and also we scale our code base, it should actually embrace this and have a good scalability. And also, this is super important, is consistency across code base. So I think there is a pattern called the lava anti-pattern, if I remember correctly, which it means that we have multiple ways to do the same thing across our code base. So following, like defining and following architecture, which should allow us to try to reduce those lab anti-patterns and try to actually not repeat ourselves and not and have especially consistency across our entire code base to be able to bring this consistency and be able to remove duplicities. So everything is based upon this book. It's called Clean Code. It's by Robert C. Martin. So this actually has a link to Amazon. You can, download, no, not download it, but buy it from Amazon, or you can look it for online. I totally recommend it. It's a pretty known book, and I recommend anyone to actually read this. So when I landed into this clean code and clean architecture, it always talks about more like Java in general, and I never thought about how actually this could be landed into an Android per se. So actually, how would all these concepts fit in Android? And before actually doing that, I just want to give some of the hints and principles that this clean architecture actually follows. So first and foremost is the independence of frameworks. So the clean architecture, the clean code, what it tries to do is based on the principle of the architecture should not depend on the existence of some libraries. So this allows us to actually use such frameworks as tools rather than actually having to cram our system into those limited constraints. So also it should be testable. So the business rules can actually be tested, should be actually be tested without the UI or database or web server or any other external element. So of course it should be the independent the UI. This and the under specific cases are a bit different, but in general, the UI should be actually be able to be swapped without actually having major changes in your whole business logic. So in this case, for example, we could pass, imagine, from a web UI to a console UI without having to change actually your business rules. Then it should be independent of database. This is the concept that we should be able to swap database or actually data providers easily without having to have major changes and major across the entire code base. So the whole idea regarding this independent of database is that we should be able to create abstractions to be able to actually be able to perform these things seamlessly. And then finally, also like independent of any external agency. So in fact, that your business rules or simply don't know anything about all about the outside world. So this is just the principles where clean code and clean architecture actually bases its entire solution upon. So of course, we need to define certain goals. So the goals of defining the architecture should be easy to maintain, of course. It should be easy to test. And then it should be very cohesive. So it means that we should have the focus our classes to focus to do one thing and solely one thing at a time. And then also, of course, decouple. So by this, we should try to that changing something major in one class should not affect the others, and vice versa. So if we actually look now, dive into the clean architecture, there is 4 different, this is like a drawing that you can see here on the left, which is defining and dividing everything upon the 4 different concepts. We have the entities, which are in the middle. We have the use cases, which are the surrounding. So as you can see, it's based upon circles. And there is this dependency rule, these lines that you see towards the left. And this is indicating that everything in the outer circle, everything in the inner circle should never depend on the outer circle. So what I mean by this, for example, so we start by the beginning we're talking about entities. So entities in our case, it will be the business objects of the application, for example. And then if you look at the use cases is something then that in the clean code and the clean architecture is used widely, and it's a super important concept on this idea, is that the use cases, they are the ones which actually orchestrates the flow of data to and from the entities. Also, they can also be called interactors. Then we have something called the presenters, or in the clean code, I think it calls it interface adapters or something like that, which is just a set of adapters to actually convert the data from the format, from the most convenient case for each of the cases. For example, in this case, it will convert data from the use cases to actually to be able to convert it into the UI or the framework in itself. That in this case, it will be, for example, Android through activities and fragments. And then finally, as I say, the outer layer, it will be the UI part, which is, the clean architecture established as frameworks and drivers, which is all the tools that has to do with the UI tools framework. So Android, activities, fragments, and everything. So as you can see, our entities, use cases, for example, and presenters should never be aware per se of how actually our UI is implemented. And so that's the whole thing around this circle and this dependency rule. So if we actually look now into, after diving into the general concept, how actually this could apply to Android per se. So a practical example of doing this clean architecture in actually in a real project, it will be like, let's say, divide everything in 3 big layers. So you have a presentation layer, you have a domain layer, and then you have a data layer. So later I will go more deeply into each of these layers. But so as for you to understand, the presentation layer is something like a model view presenter, is something that is dealing with activities, fragments, and presenters, and is the one that is coordinating and actually, all the rendering that it has to do with the application itself. The domain layer, that's where actually our business logic holds all our business logic. Let's say our use cases for every single type of business logic that we actually need to do. This business logic could be from, for example, things like logging, or things like validation of data, or be able to compose different data from different repositories to be able to create a more complex response that a presenter has to be able to render. And then finally, also we have the data layer. This is everything that it has to do with all the data and the fetching and how actually this data should be provided to the use cases. So as you can see, everything, all those dotted lines, it means that each of them are independent from each other, and everything is always contact through interfaces. So one of the key concepts of clean code in general is that you always want to deal with abstractions and you don't want to deal with concretions. So later I will go how we can actually achieve that through, for example, dependency injection. But if we dive into the presentation layer in itself, as I say, this could be like, we could use anything like MVP, MVC, MVVM. This is like, in this case, fragments and activities are only views. So they're only classes where you can actually, from the presenters, you will tell them what to do and what to render, but they don't hold any logic at all. Then again, the communication is always through interfaces. And then you have something called a presenter. That presenter is something that it holds the view logic, like if we should, when we should display like a loading, or when we should display a retry button, or we should display a title or whatever. So the presenter is the one who's actually holding this layer, and also is the one who's actually using these individual use cases for data composition and validation. So the presenter in itself does not have any business logic per se. It has rendering logic. So if you need to fetch different things and then you need to show different buttons according all these things, that's where the presentation comes into place. Again, we're already having talks for be able to find a way to maybe accommodate this presentation layer using through things like, Anna is working on that through data binding and everything, but at the end of the day, the presentation layer, it will be the one that is holding just how things are being rendered, not how things actually, they should be fetched, or how things should be actually composed in terms of actually data and business logic out of it. Then we have the domain layer, which I told you is the one in the middle. So this one is the one that's holding all the business rules which are implemented. So like in the case that I saw a few weeks ago, so for example, if we should display broadcasters, we should return a list of broadcasters, within, for example, certain days. That's an example of business rule. It's something that it has a business value, and actually it's not a decision that has to be technical, but it's actually a decision that has to be done through business. So here's where all that logic would actually be placed. In this case, all the logic is self-contained. It's in a single use cases, and I will show you later an example of a use case. Usually this domain layer, you want to make it just pure Java. There is no need to be able to have Android here at all. So there should not be Android dependencies, and you can actually just use RX and Dagger and everything to be able to compose your use cases. And as I say, it's completely framework independent. And then finally, all the external communications will be done through interfaces. So as I say, when you actually And I'll show you later a case when you're dealing with repositories, that's part of the data layer. You would always deal with the abstractions, and then through dependency injection, you will decide through that in the moment that you're actually injecting the requirements for that use case, which actually dependencies and which actually concretions of those abstractions you actually want to pass by. So we could actually change pretty easily the behavior without actually having to modify, in this case, the use case. And also it makes it extremely easy to test as well, because as you are always dealing with interfaces, you just, mocking is just easy peasy. And then finally, there is this called data layer. So the data layer is the one where all the data, is coming from, and it's completely transparent for the client. In this case, is where all the external communication is done, and it's always will be done through interfaces as well. And then there is a heavy use of something that's called factory methods to be able to create data providers. So in this case, all data sources. In this case, for example, I can give you the example that is here displayed. So if you look at, for example, this, it could be like a user repository. In this case, imagine that we started with okay, we want to get the user from the cloud. Okay, perfect. So we actually created this data factory, and then we say, okay, we have a data repository which actually creating this data source, which the data should come from the cloud. But now we also want to add memory cache, because we want to think that this is the data that is going to be accessed really often. So we want to store as well temporary data in memory to be able to actually hold this. So without actually doing any modifications anywhere, you could just create a new data provider, which everything is based on a simple, in a common interface for all the different data providers. And then you would only change the data factory to take into this account depending on the rule that you want to do. So, and you could do the same this with, like, if you want to have this cache, or you want to have a local database or whatever. So as you can see, it's based upon the concept of extending without actually modifying the core of the things that you've done. So only by modifying the data factories and understanding when things should be, which data provider should create in certain moments or not, you can add all these new functionalities without changing anything else from the code. And for example, of course, the data provider from this cloud and memory, they're completely independent from each other, and they never have to understand anything about each other. And of course, there is a few testing recommendations. And one of the good things is here that you can focus your testing for each of the specific layers. For example, for the presentation layer, you can have Android instrumentation and Espresso, for example, for integration and functional testing. Your domain layer could be, a unitary test with JUnit and Mockito. And then, for example, your data layer actually relies on Android as well, because, we need to rely on things like HTTP communication and everything. And, at the end of the day, that also belongs to Android. We could use Roboelectric for be able to, mock those dependencies with Android. And of course, also you use something like JUnit and Mockito for integration and unitary tests. So all of this sounds pretty theoretical. And so now I just want to show you really, really tiny bit of code. I think it's easier and it's more comprehensive if you actually look at the references later on, and you actually look at the examples there. And it's a better way to understand everything. But I just want to give you a brief example of some things here. So of course, the whole solution is based upon the RxJava. I don't want to go too much into detail into RxJava. You could have a few sessions only with RxJava. It's a pretty extensive and advanced tool. But one of the cool things that, as you can see here, is the concept of streams. So in this case, we have the view, which the view in this case, imagine, is actually just an interface with the fragment or the activity is implementing, which actually will communicate the presenter. And the presenter is the one who actually will create a subscriber. And then down the line, at some point, you will see through the chain that at some point there is an observable which is actually created and then composed. And then during the different steps, you can actually change that observable depending on the need that you actually have. And then that actually will present finally through the subscriber the results in the presenter in itself. So one of the things that it has here, so of course, through RxJava will be the coupling between the observables and the subscribers. It would actually simplify a lot the synchronous tasks. We already use RxJava, so I don't want to go too much into detail, and I think we are already using it sometimes. I remember there was an issue with some of the subscribers and subscriptions, but that's something completely out of the context right now. And then one of the cool things with RxJava and this type of architecture as well is that we can actually perform data transformations and composition. So we can actually combine multiple observers without affecting the client, which makes our solution more scalable. And also error handling. RxJava is great tool for using error handling and custom up exceptions. And we can emit a signal to the consumer when an error has occurred with any of the observables. So as you can see here, the chain is that a view will actually trigger some action, which the presenter would actually use a domain use case, which the use case would actually get the data from the repository, which the repository will get the data from any of the providers that we actually define. And then once actually that happens, it will just return an observable, which it will just going up the ladder until it actually gets to the presenter, and then the presenter will render those items in the view itself. So, and as you can see, you can make compositions, for example, in the domain case, or you can actually listen through RxJava to certain events and be able to, for example, save things in cache or something like that. Meanwhile, you need to do or clear the cache if something happens. So, and that's the cool thing. It's just a stream, and then you can modify it along the way. And for example, this is just a simple use case. I think this is some older code from, some older code from a use case, but you can get an example. It's almost the same, identical to the one that I've been using lately for other things. So in this case, a use case is just a simple class where it just passes a thread executor, and then you can pass a post-execution thread, and these are actually just interfaces as well. So during dependency injection, when you actually create the use cases, you can define what where you want to throw that So where you want to actually execute this code, and then also where you want to listen to the changes. For example, in the case of Android, we need to listen to the change in the UI thread. So this is great because it just makes trivial actually asynchronous tasks. And so actually every use case could actually doesn't run in the UI thread. And then, then when actually the results are actually in place, it will just post it through the post-execution thread. And in our case, in Android, most of the time, it will be the UI thread. But again, this is something that it can be changed, and it can be changed through dependency injection. And then, of course, an unsubscribe method as well to be able to unsubscribe for the use cases once things happen. For example, like the activity is finishing, then it will call the presenter, and then the presenter should unsubscribe from whatever of the use cases, so we make sure we don't leak anything. So I don't know how well you can actually see it, but I wanted to give you a brief example of a real case scenario, for example, of how a use case could actually look at in real life. So for example, this is a class which is called the search medias by area. So it's just, it will just call something called medias, and then it will, search that media endpoint through, depending on a latitude and a longitude that you actually give. So in this case, as you can see, we have a use case, which is extending the base class use case, and then saying, okay, we have a return type of observable with list medias, which will be the return type. And then we want to pass some parameters because we want to pass the latitude and longitude, from the presenter, it will be taken from Android to this use case. So, you can even do it from other ways as well. But anyway, the whole idea here is, as you can see, the use case itself, it gets injected, and then we can actually pass the different dependencies through, dependency inversion to make sure that, we can always mock these things. And as this preference repository and media repository, they are interfaces. The concrete classes are called preference data repository and media data repository, that it will be created in the dependency injection configuration. So mocking this is just trivial. And then, of course, the same thing goes with thread executor and post-execution thread. So the same thing is here. And as you can see, I wanted to give this type of example because just think about like how powerful this could be, because when you build this use case, you can create composition. And this line of code, the only thing it's saying is like, okay, so you want to get the distance from the preference repository, and then the observable that distance is, this method is going to give you containing the distance itself, which is the max distance that we want to achieve, that which is taken from a preference setting somewhere else. We just want to say, okay, we want to search that area with that max distance taken into account and the current latitude and longitude, given to us. So as you can see here, we're composing from different repositories. And this is something that is truly powerful. In use cases, for example, you can, before fetching data from the repositories, you could perform validation for fields and things like that. And it's a great way to encapsulate all this business logic into unitary classes. Then, so just to give as well a brief example of, for example, what a presenter could look like. So a presenter is just a class which just extends a base class called presenter. And in this case, we're giving for example, the use case that we actually want to do with this media list presenter, and then we are just injecting that use case through dependency injection. And then the only thing that we do is like, okay, at the moment that we need to execute this thing, we will just say, okay, hey, use case, execute yourself. Set this as a list observer. So saying, okay, whenever you have things coming out of the stream, like notify me through this media list observer that I'll show you in the next slide. And then just get this different lat long that I got from somewhere, for example. Like imagine or it could be in this case not, but imagine it could be like something the user introduces or whatever. And then of course you need to dispose the use case to make sure you don't leak things. And this will be, for example, how the media list observer will look in the presenter in itself. So, if you're familiar with RxJava, you have the onComplete, onError, and the next. And as you can see, the only thing we're doing is when the data comes, we just show it in the collection, which in this case, it will be a method which we will only deal in the presenter with the view. And the view, again, is only an interface, which the fragment is actually or the activity is implemented. So the presenter does not have any knowledge about fragments, activities, or Android views per se. So it's just have it deals with the interface. And then through whatever is happening on the stream, it will, we can perform different things according to this. So yeah, so that's a really, really, really brief, super short description of how everything could actually work. There is this entire solution. It heavily uses dependency injection. I think is something that we should use vastly and widely because we can actually achieve dependency inversion to be able to, as I say, depend on abstractions and not in concretions. So we could actually always depend on the interfaces and then inject in certain moments, the concretions for those classes that we want to use. We could actually reuse components. In this case, since the dependencies can be injected and configured externally, of course, the objects instantiation resides in one place, isolated and decoupled. So the object instantiation of the dependency for the classes are not in the same class in itself, but actually given to that class somewhere else. And it's completely isolated and decoupled from the class in itself. And of course, this is, it's possible to inject mock implementations, which makes it super easy to testing. So you can have custom injections through your mock build variant, for example, in your test build variant. So you can actually mock a whole bunch of things. For example, you can mock from an entire web server to mock other different things with through this technique and through dependency injection. Of course, this is something more trivial. So, okay, how you would actually organize. There is no clear way, to define this. You can have two different options, which is packaged by layer, meaning like this is something similar to have some parts of our code base. So, which contains items which are usually not related to each other, but they share a common area of functionality of layer. For example, it could be, in this case, as you can see in the examples, activities or fragments. So if you think about it like, the login activity and the purchase activity, in reality, the only thing they share is that they're actually activities, but they don't share any business logic or anything related between them. So of course, this brings low cohesion and low modularity between the packages, and also high coupling between those actually packages. And then you have package by feature. That some of the code base we actually do this as well. So the package reflects a feature set. In this case, all the items are related to a single feature and only that feature into one single package. This brings high cohesion and high modularity and minimal coupling. And examples could be, for example, like a login feature. So you could, or like a user feature where you can have all the for example, the activities, the presenters, the use cases, and all those things in the domain and the data through those packages. And then of course, everything well defined, but once you actually need to modify a feature, which is actually, for example, login, you would only modify those certain packages and not packages across the entire code base. And also one of the good things with this is that it isolates features, especially with larger teams. So people can actually be working in their feature and not collide with the packages being changed by other team members or whatever, or other projects and other people. So as I say, there is no clear, follow on here. It's just a few ways to organize this, and then it's just a matter of choosing which one to actually do this. And then finally, as I said, so references. So here you guys have the book. You have the Clean Architecture project where, you know, all this information is being based upon. You have the evolution of the, you know, of the explaining when they started to use RxJava and then be able to actually use Dagger 2 and dependency injection. And then this is something that I did myself, this instant search app, if you want to take a look as well, based upon this. Is like a really simple, like it's a simple demo app. It has a lot of things still to do, but still you can get an overview of how this clean architecture could, you know, be used in as well in an application itself. I didn't have so much time to look into the new Android. How do they call it? Android architectural components, I think they call them. Yeah, exactly. So it has a similar concept, but but one of the things that it takes the life cyclers into, like the life cycle of the activities into account and the use cases, but it uses similar approach to this. But I will need to like investigate further, like how we could actually, how actually that architecture is actually being placed, and then how it would actually play along with something like this. Again, architecture is something that it will bring a lot of benefits in general, and also it will bring a lot of consistency through our code base, and also especially bring a lot of testability around our code base, which is something that it will be greatly appreciated, and then be able to actually test most of the key functionality that we have through our application and complex system. So yeah, I think that's from me. So there's no more. And I hope you guys, I know it's a lot to take, and I recommend to look through the references and documentation, and then look at the examples especially, and then you can get a very better overview of what a clean architecture is and what, you know, entitles, and especially the concepts and ideas behind it, and the mentality as a developer to be able to create the code which, you know, sort of complies with this philosophy. And yeah, that's it from my side. So if you have any questions.
Yeah, so thanks very much. It was very, very nice. I really want to read that book now. But apart from that, yeah, I do have a couple of questions. So firstly, I'm not really sure. There's something which confused me. So in general, you said that you put the MVP into presentation layer, where in my understanding, M stands for model, like database model or network model, where this is like a view model in here, right? So it's more following MVVM, but only in the model view, view model and view inside of this presentation thing. Correct me if I'm wrong.
So yeah, in the case, so if I understand correctly, the idea will be that when you create a presentation layer, isn't a layer which is independent in its own. So theoretically, what you want to do is you have models specifically only for that layer. So let's say you don't even have database models and everything. So actually that would be in the data layer. So one of the things that around that concept, and this is a bit more controversial in the sense that it requires a lot of work, but the idea is that each of those layers are independent of each other. So the model in the presentation is only a model for the presentation layer. A model in the business, in the data layer, for example, it will be a model for the data layer. And then what you do through mappers, you actually map those different models between those different layers. So
works for me. So we do have model in a data layer as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
other thing is, you said that in the domain layer we should use the Java code only, which is not specific to anything like Android. What if we would use like retrofit, or like, this is common thing which should land it in a domain layer, right?
Yeah, so for me, the thing is retrofit, it's not a domain layer for me. So a domain layer, it would be like, okay, think about business rules that you have in your application. So one business rule is how our password should be verified, for example. And so, how should we validate that, on the client side that a password is valid or not? Or how many items should we display based upon, the data that we are today? Those are actually business rules. In this case, retrofit is a framework which actually it's a tool which is telling us, okay, helping us to retrieve the information, and that should be in the data layer and specifically in a cloud provider, or not provider, but in a cloud data source. So, or data provider, saying, okay, so in this cloud data provider, in this case, it's actually using retrofit to be able to fetch the data. But the domain layer does not care where the data is coming from, because that data could become coming from a database or from a memory. The business in itself, the business logic in itself does not care about that. That's the data layer who's handling where that data should come from. And the business or the domain model, the only thing cares is like, okay, I get data and I need to do business rules, apply business rules to this data to be able to actually, meet the business rules requirements from our clients, or from whoever is actually trying to do things for the feature that we need to develop, for example.
Okay, the last thing is a testing. So in general, I think that you also can use Roboelectric and Mockito in the Vue testing, right?
Yeah. I mean, at the end, it was just suggestions. You can use Roboelectric in the Vue. I think I used it as well for unitary testing the fragments, for example, as well. So at the end, you can use whatever you want. It was just a recommendation. But the good thing is that in the presentation layer, you can let's say compartmentalize a lot. Your testing dependencies in each of the modules. For example, in your domain module, there is no need to to use Espresso when you only have Java code, for example. So. But you're free to use whatever you want for testing. So it's just recommendations. So
yeah, sure. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much. That was very useful.
You're welcome, Anna.
Yeah, thank you indeed, Javier. I think it was very educating and enlightening. And I do encourage everybody in the Android team community to step forward if you want to talk about something, or you want to raise a general subject that everybody can learn from. I think that's one of the key prospects of the tech talks that we have. Not only just catching up on what everybody is doing. I think it's very it adds a lot of added value to these meetings, and I'm looking forward to the session where we actually see maybe a small refactoring of a class, or examples of how it can be applied to our existing code. It can be something very simple, something hopefully that everybody knows how it's currently built and how it would look like using the principles that you just demonstrated. I think that would be the best way to actually digest, I would say, all of this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's the challenging part. So I think the challenging part of this is definitely how we could apply principles like this in our code base, and then how we could apply it to it. So
going forward, and also on some of the existing code at least. Because yeah. So again, thank you very much. We have approximately 15 minutes, so we're definitely not going to cover everybody. So we're just going to do it on a voluntary basis, meaning if somebody has something they want to raise or share, that any concern or something that worth sharing with everybody, now is the time. But assuming we're not.
Yeah, guys.
Yeah.
I have a pretty the thing which I can't really jump over easy. So guys, where we got that UI builder NSLs at the moment. We can add the margins on the sides. So my designs are that I need to add the margins on the sides in the global margins, which are not in cell but on the list component, and then one of my cells is a full width, so I need to extend that view over the margins which I got inside. Do you guys had any idea how I could solve this problem? Because later on I got a grid which got bigger margin on a left right than a middle part, so it's hard to solve.
And I think builder have UI limitations. This is one of them. Design should adjust. It shouldn't be solved.
Sorry, what?
Ruben is saying that it's something that we have to live with because the UI builder
currently
has
has
limitations.
limitations. One of the limitations is equal spacing between all the parts. You don't have top, bottom, left or right. Some does, some doesn't. Okay, spacing is equally in both platforms, and this is how it is, and the design should adjust to it.
Yeah, that's one approach, but if there is a smart technical solution that we can apply or some sort of...
because
I mean, for me, that is fair enough, Ruben. Thank you very much. It's something, you know, I'm a new developer, so I don't know. I might not be aware about things which are available here to solve the problems or not. But if there is a limitation, then I just need to raise it to the graphic designer, project manager, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
the
but
limitation
the issue
comes from the UI builder itself because it doesn't give the option even to customize it.
I know, but the idea is they're trying to solve, and it came also on the iOS side, is that they want the UI builder to enable it. And what now Anna is asking is what we need to do in the Android code in order to enable it, assuming that it will be supported somehow in the UI builder.
Did the Zap team approve it as a feature?
It was discussed with the Zap team, and I know that Anton at least looked at it. Are you familiar with the requirement, Gil?
Did Anton have
Why can you repeat on this issue?
Hey guys, Alex here. I'm actually have a task to implement that I'll be working on today. So Bianca requesting this and Ryan approved that. So we have to.
It has been.
I have to now.
So the approach that you took is not necessarily the approach that is going to happen now. It's something that is in the works. Now, Anna, can you please repeat what the requirement was?
So you can imagine grid. I got two columns. They got a space on a side, 16 dp on both sides, then 12 dp in the middle between them. So I can't really set up this inside of the cell. I have to put the margins outside of the list view, which is global margin. But then the top cell, which is hero, should have no margin for the image. So I was trying to set up like margin -15, -16, or padding -16 inside of the cell, but the only result which I got is a cutted image. So it's very hard to solve at the moment, and I have no idea how to solve it with the existing code. However, a couple of us are working on the new cells, how to implement the families in the new way better and quicker. So it might be that we will just postpone that for now until we get the better solution for loading the cells itself.
Anna, can you set the padding on the grid component and not on the composite component via the UI builder?
So on the you can't do that from the UI builder unless I haven't found anything what you can set up from the UI builder. Maybe you know something what I don't know.
No, I'm not really familiar a lot with the UI builders, but I think this is the solution to enable it via the UI builder, because if we are using the old template that use JSON, so I'm able to do it. So I guess this is a gap that we have in the UI builder and not in our code, like our composite component at least.
And Alex, you said you were working on something at the moment, or you started looking at something?
Yes, I have a task to extend only the headers to match the width of the screen.
Yeah, I wrote you a comment, Alex, about it, and maybe we can talk about it, this pull request later.
Anand, are you familiar with the family padding setters?
Family padding setters. Okay. Yeah. Just if you guys are happy to drop me a couple of. I don't want to take too much space in here because probably someone else have questions for the community. So if you can just drop a couple of ideas how I could on a channel, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Kariti has a nice thing to present.
I added a nice feature to the custom text view. It's a new attribute that you can customize in your XML. The attribute name is, just a second, I give you the custom text view. It's should hide empty text. This is the attribute. If you are setting this attribute to true, so if the text view is empty, so it just will be gone. You can use it if you want. It's merged to the dev. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Anybody else?
Can I ask you something, guys? I was working with a plugin for a broadcast selector, and the issue that I encounter is that the moment that we launch the broadcast selector plugin, the intro hasn't finished loading yet. And in the case that for my plugin, it actually contains UI. So because I think all the broadcast selector plugins are based, on like IPs and things like that. So there is no the user doesn't have to do anything. But in the requirement that I have for the plugin, that you need to display, like a selector. So that's what it's already deployed. So you can, put it to your project, and then it will allow you to select on the startup, and then from the menu, it will allow you to, select the broadcaster that you want. The thing is, the issue that I have is that there's exactly that it does when the broadcaster selector, plugin interface is called. The intro hasn't finished, so it doesn't show the intro entirely.
But it sounds okay. I think there's a confusion. It sounds like you need the broadcaster switch screen. Okay, broadcaster selector is basically when the app is launched, this plugin is given an opportunity to decide which is the default broadcaster that should be used. Okay. In your case, you just need to present an extra screen to switch between the broadcasters, no?
Yeah, but it has to be in a startup as well, in app startup.
But you said you don't want it to be in the intro. You want it to
no, so in both. So it has to be from the menu, and when you launch the app for the first time, when you have the plugin included, it should show this, selector thing.
But it's async. Can't you?
You can use the
or something.
You can use we have a hookup, no? A hookup interface.
Yeah, so the problem with the hookup interface is that I cannot choose the broadcast, because when the hookup interface gets called, the collection is being already loaded. So so it doesn't work, because I can just change the in the app data, I can change the selected broadcaster ID, but the collection is being already loaded, so there's no effect. So it doesn't matter what you pick, it would always choose whatever is already being loaded.
You have a method in the application, in either custom application or generic application. You have a method to reload the app. If you call
I already used that. So
if you call this method, it kills the app and everything starts from the beginning with the broadcaster that you set.
Yeah, I use that for when I change broadcasters from the menu, but from the startup, if you change the broadcaster and the application starts all over again, then it will be a bit.
This is one option.
I know.
Yeah,
I mean, for now, what the option I want is that the intro, it will not display entirely for the first time. So, and that's it. So.
No, the experience you will have is that the intro video will start, and then you will see your dialogue, and then you will select a different broadcaster, and then the intro will start again. Because when the app is killed, basically the intro starts from the beginning and everything starts again. Okay, this is the implementation of the refresh. But
yeah, let me double check. I did that before, and I cannot remember. I need to double check again because I tried with the hookup, and it didn't, and then I realized that it was not changing the broadcaster. So and then in the generic intro app or whatever it's called, I cannot remember. So in generic interactivity, I meant. So I need to take a look. Okay, anyway, so you said there is
you can do it also with broadcaster selector, though, I think.
Yeah, but the thing is with the broadcaster selector, when I set the cached selected broadcaster, it's being already loaded by the activity. When if I do it through the hook and through the broadcaster selector in itself, if I use it, then the problem is that it launches too early, so you don't see the intro. So you only see like a few, couple of seconds of the intro, I think, or like a second or two. I cannot remember. It was something like that.
But it happens only once. Is it really critical?
Yeah, so it will happen only once. So that's the good thing, at least. So
yeah.
Anyway,
yeah. So those are your two options. I don't know if we have any other solutions.
Yeah, I don't want to touch that loading code. So for the moment. So I will. Okay, I will let the PM know then. Okay, thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
I think Atanas has a broadcaster selector with UI, but I'm not sure in Quizy.
No, it doesn't have UI.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay. Anything else, guys? Okay. If not, I think we're done for today. Thanks again, Javier. And thank you, everyone, for
Yeah,
joining.
you're welcome.
Thanks, guys.
And have a good
Okay.
day.
Bye, guys.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.